The story of the Black Brunswickers, also known as the Black Legion or Horde, stands out among the many great stories of the Napoleonic Wars. To fully understand the story of the Black Brunswickers, a bit of background to their formation and journey is required. Until 1806, the Duchy of Brunswick-Lunenburg was ruled by Charles William Ferdinand, who up to that point had had an extensive military career. He was made a Prussian general in 1773 and had taken part in the War of Bavarian Succession from 1778 to 1779, the Prussian invasion of Holland, 1787, and the War of the First Coalition. It was during the War of the First Coalition that he was part of the Brunswick Proclamation, which threatened France and the people of Paris especially if anything were to happen to Louis XVI or his family. It would have the opposite of the intended effect, eventually leading to the execution of Louis XVI. It should be noted, however, that the Duke of Brunswick did not actually write the proclamation. The main force behind it was Louis XVI's cousin, Louis Joseph de Bourbon, who led a large force of emigres in the Allied army. Regardless, however, his name on the proclamation would have consequences both at the moment and the future for his holdings. The Duke of Brunswick would command the Prussian army during the Battle of Valmy in 1792, where it was defeated by the French, allowing the revolution to survive. He would continue to command the Prussian forces, however, until his resignation in 1794. Jumping forward to the War of the Fourth Coalition, the Duke was brought out of retirement to lead Prussian forces at the request of the Prussian Queen, despite being over 70 years old at the time. He would lead Prussian forces at the Battle of Auerstadt against the French, who were led by Marshal Davout. During the battle, the Duke of Brunswick would be shot in the face and blinded in both eyes. He would die from his wounds almost a month later. After the Duke's death and the end of the War of the Fourth Coalition, his territory was mostly incorporated into the new Kingdom of Westphalia set up by Napoleon. It's here, however, that the story of the Black Brunswickers can begin properly. Once the Duke of Brunswick had passed, his holdings should have been inherited by his son, Frederick William. However, Napoleon's seizure of the lands made that impossible. Frederick now had ample reason to detest the French, both for killing his father in battle and for seizing his rightful land. In the lead up to the War of the Fifth Coalition, Frederick sold most of his remaining estates and used much of his money to form a small personal army, the Black Brunswickers. The Black Duke's new army consisted of around 2,300 men, with 2 battalions of light infantry, a Jaeger battalion, a single company of sharpshooters armed with rifles, a mixed cavalry force of Uhlans and hussars, and finally a battery of horse artillery that consisted of 4 guns. The Black Brunswickers would go on to serve with the Austrian army during the Danube campaign in 1809 under the command of Archduke Charles. Though the Brunswickers fought with the Austrians during the campaign and the Battle of Wagram, Austrian defeat meant the Black Duke was in a tough position. He and his men now found themselves deep in the middle of Napoleonic Europe, with no allies nearby to fight with on the continent. Instead of surrendering, however, the Black Duke made a bold decision. His small army would march hundreds of kilometers to the coast to try and join up with the British. While the plan might have appeared crazy at first, marching hundreds of kilometers through enemy-controlled territory isn't something a normal army can usually do. The Brunswickers had several things going for them. Firstly, their size. Though only numbering slightly over 2,000 men meant they could only do so much in battle, it also meant that they were not perceived as too large of a threat. No need to send a force of 20,000 or even 10,000 to deal with a force as small as the Brunswickers. Secondly, at the start of their journey, almost everyone considered the fighting to be over, so no one realized the Black Duke's intentions until his forces were well underway. The Black Legion began its journey in Zwickau on the 24th of July and reached the town of Halle on the 26th. Now in the Kingdom of Westphalia proper, the Brunswickers seized the town's funds and continued on their march. When news reached Jerome Bonaparte, who ruled Westphalia, he ordered forces to stop the Brunswickers' march immediately. The nearest force to the Black Duke's advance was the 5th Westphalian Infantry Regiment, which numbered just under 2,000 strong, only slightly less than the Brunswickers. Under the command of Colonel Marionette, however, the Westphalians had orders to combine with other forces over 100 kilometers away before engaging with the Black Duke's forces. The regiment managed to reach the town of Halberstadt at 11 a.m. on the 29th of July. At 1 p.m., however, news reached them that the Brunswickers were only 14 kilometers away at the town of Quindenberg. Marionette did little upon receiving the news, likely not expecting any sudden attack from the Brunswickers. That assumption would be proven sorely mistaken soon after, however. Upon hearing that a regiment of Westphalian infantry was alone in a nearby town, the Black Duke immediately marched his forces to attack. Word would reach Marionette of the rapidly approaching force around 5 p.m. However, at that point, the Black Legion was almost upon his position. Marionette quickly sent out his voltigeurs to skirmish and delay the enemy, while the rest of his forces manned the town's walls and gates. Marionette forces were supported by the town's garrison as well. The Voltigeur skirmish line was quickly forced back by the Brunswickers, and they were forced to retreat into the town. At 7 p.m., hot on the heels of the retreating skirmishers, the Duke's forces attacked in 3 columns, each aimed at one of the town's gates. The Black Duke himself led the assault on the Haus-Lieber gate, while the other 2 columns attacked the Kullinge and Johannes gates. Reportedly, the Brunswickers could be heard shouting, "Sieg oder Tod," victory over death, as they made their assaults. While the gates were well defended, the Brunswickers managed to breach the defenses at each gate and push the defenders off the medieval walls of the town. The gates were cleared and cavalry charged through, heading for the town square. Upon seeing that they were surrounded by cavalry, the forces that had been gathered there as a reserve surrendered immediately. Fighting did not stop, however, as the Westphalian troops that had been forced off the walls continued to put up resistance inside buildings, in small groups of a few men. The Brunswickers were forced to clear the town, building by building, until all the defenders were either killed or surrendered. By midnight, almost all of the town was captured, except for a few larger buildings in the richer section of town that were barricaded and defended by 2 grenadier companies. These forces, too, would be forced to surrender, however, when artillery was brought up and the grenadiers' position was made untenable. Out of a force of 2,100 men, the Brunswickers suffered roughly 400 killed and wounded. The Westphalians, meanwhile, had 600 dead and wounded, with over 2,000 being captured by the Brunswickers. While the town was now completely secured, the Legion would not remain there long, as they marched out the same day, July 30th. The Brunswickers would not depart alone, however, as over 200 of the Westphalians chose to join them. Before they left, the Westphalians' equipment and supplies were also looted. From Halberstadt, the Black Duke led his forces to his former territory in the city of Brunswick. While there, more men were recruited into his force, armed with weapons taken from the Westphalians, and forced to quickly move on, as speed was now key. More forces sent by Jerome were beginning to converge on their location. News reached the Black Duke that another force of Westphalians lay in front of him. This time, however, they numbered over 5,000 and were commanded by French General Rebel. To make matters worse, a division of Dutch was also approaching from the rear, reportedly last sighted at Halberstadt. Acting quickly, the Black Duke marched to meet Rebel's forces before he was surrounded. Even still, his men were severely outnumbered. The Black Duke's forces arrived at Ypres slightly after 2 p.m., with Rebel's forces beginning to arrive in the vicinity around 3 o'clock. Westphalian cuirassiers were the first to approach the village, but were quickly fired upon by sharpshooters and forced to retreat. A Westphalian infantry regiment was then brought up to assault the village. To their surprise, however, they found the village abandoned. Instead of holding the village, the Black Duke had decided to station his troops on several hills behind it. Deciding not to wait to be attacked, the Black Duke personally led an assault to retake Ypres. His horse was shot from under him, and though he was unharmed, the attack eventually failed to retake the village. Another more direct attack on the Westphalian lines also failed, though a cavalry charge by the Brunswickers did face more success. Ultimately, the battle turned into an artillery duel, with neither side gaining a clear victory. That night, as the Black Duke planned to use the cover of darkness to launch another attack on the village, it was discovered that Rebel had not been sitting idle, instead using the cover of darkness to move his own forces out of the village. The next day, the road was clear of Westphalian troops, and the Brunswickers were able to continue their march. During the battle, the Westphalians suffered roughly somewhere between 200 to 500 casualties. The Brunswickers suffered fewer losses, however the exact number is harder to come by. It could be anywhere from only 40 to more likely a few hundred. Regardless of losses, however, Rebel had failed to halt the Brunswickers' journey, as they were able to make it all the way to the sea on the 7th of August, and were quickly picked up by the British. From there, they would eventually be transported to the Isle of Wight and would enter British service. The Black Duke was quite welcome in England, both for his refusal to stop fighting Napoleon and his relations to the, at the time, Prince Regent, George IV. He was the Duke's cousin and brother-in-law. Thanks to that initial political power, the Brunswickers would be re-equipped and trained with British equipment. More recruits were also added to the ranks, however the presence of the King's German Legion meant that the Brunswickers were mostly left with less desirables. Prisoners of war, for example, who could not be counted on to the same extent as the older, more seasoned troops. In early 1811, the Black Brunswickers were sent to fight in the Peninsular War. Political favor in Britain, however, did not extend to the war in Spain and Portugal. After arriving, the now renamed Brunswick Old Jaegers were divided up by companies to fight with a number of other British divisions. They had remained divided up among the British until the end of the war in 1814. Despite not being considered very reliable troops by the British, the Brunswickers would serve with Wellington's army and fight in many of the major battles that would see the French slowly pushed out of Spain. In 1813, the Black Duke was able to return home and reclaim his territory of Brunswick. Once there, he quickly began recruiting more men into his forces. By the time of Napoleon's return in 1815, the Black Brunswickers numbered over 5,000 strong, and they would once more serve under Wellington's command when he moved to fight the French. At the Battle of Quarterbras, the Brunswickers would see relatively short but intense combat against the French, taking over 500 casualties, including the Black Duke who was shot during the battle. The Brunswickers would carry on fighting with the British at the Battle of Waterloo, helping to repel Ney's cavalry attack, and fought against the Imperial Guard during the most critical moment of the battle. During the battle, the Brunswickers would suffer an additional 600 casualties, meaning that after Napoleon's final defeat, the Black Brunswickers would have suffered over 20% casualties during the campaign. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars, elements of the Black Brunswickers' distinctive uniforms would continue to be present in the Brunswick and later Prussian forces. The objective of reclaiming the territories of Brunswick for which the Black Brunswickers were formed had been achieved, even if the Black Duke did not live to see the final end of Napoleon. I hope you enjoyed the story of the Black Brunswickers. If you want to see more videos from the time period, check out my channel.